They hold my arms behind my back, and I already know what's coming. The whole court is watching. Not because they care what happens to me, they don't. They're watching because Chancellor Yorick Thorn promised them a spectacle, and nobody in this palace turns down a free spectacle. I'm 17. I'm a prince by blood and nothing by rank, which in this empire means I'm worth less than the guards holding me down. The priest steps forward with the ritual blade, and I finally understand why they picked today. Today is my birthday. Happy birthday to me. They're about to cut away the one thing that makes me dangerous. I want to say I fought. I didn't. There's nothing to fight when 6 armored men have your wrists nailed to a table by their grip alone, and the man ordering it is smiling at you like this is a mercy. You should thank me, Chancellor Thorn says. I'm letting you keep your life. I don't remember the pain. My mind mercifully blacked it out. What I remember is waking up 3 days later in a servant's cot, no longer a prince, no longer a threat, no longer whole. They gave me a new title, Eunuch. They gave me a new job. Serving tea to the family that ruined me. What they didn't know, what nobody in this empire understood, not even the priest who wielded the blade, is that the thing they cut away wasn't just flesh. It was the only thing keeping my bloodline's power sealed inside my body, instead of tearing it apart from within. Nobody told them that when a root bearer is cut, sometimes the power doesn't die with the flesh. Sometimes it goes looking for somewhere else to live. I spent the next 4 months serving wine to the same nobles who watched me get mutilated. I smiled when they laughed about it. I bowed when Cassian Thorn, the Chancellor's golden son, flicked wine in my face for a joke. I told myself I'd survive this. I was wrong. I didn't survive it. 4 months after the ritual, someone slipped something into my tea. I never found out who. I remember my knees hitting the floor, my vision going white at the edges, and one single thought before everything went dark. At least it's over. It wasn't over. It was the beginning. I opened my eyes screaming, and the first thing I felt was a midwife's hands catching me. I was a newborn. Somehow, impossibly, I was alive again. Smaller, weaker, wrapped in a stranger's blanket, in a house I didn't recognize, with every memory of my old life sitting inside my infant skull like a curse nobody asked for. That should have been the worst part. It wasn't even close. 3 days later, when the midwife unwrapped me to clean me for the naming ceremony, she froze. Then she called for the physician. Then the physician went pale and told my new parents to keep me indoors, away from strangers, away from anyone who might report what she'd just seen. I was born whole. Everything they cut away in my last life had come back, regrown and intact, exactly the way it should have been before Chancellor Thorn decided I was too dangerous to keep in one piece. I didn't understand what that meant yet. I would, and when I did, it changed everything. They named me Riven Ashcroft, son of a border blacksmith and a woman who sold herbs at the village market. No titles, no palace, no target on my back, or so I hoped. I kept my mouth shut about who I used to be. Nobody would have believed a toddler claiming to be a murdered prince, and even if they had, the empire that killed me once would happily finish the job a second time. But here's the part that kept me up at night, even at 5 years old, lying in a straw bed listening to my new parents argue about grain prices. I had the root back. The power that got me killed was sitting inside my body again, waiting, and I had absolutely no idea how to use it. In my old life, I was cut open before anyone ever taught me. I never learned the technique. I never even got a first lesson. I just knew I was born with something rare enough to be worth killing for, and that was it. This time, I promised myself something different. This time, I would train. I would learn to use it before anyone found out it existed. And, if the Empire's hunters ever came looking for the root again, I would make sure they regretted it. Here's what you need to know about the world I got dropped back into. The Dorian Empire doesn't run on gold or crowns. It runs on something called root power, a rare inherited energy that lets a person channel raw vitality into destructive force. Most people are born with nothing. A handful are born with a trace. And once every few generations, someone is born with a full root, strong enough to reshape a battlefield alone. The Empire calls those people treasures. The Empire also calls them threats, because a full root bearer answers to no one, not easily, and not for long. My father was a minor prince, third in line for nothing that mattered, married off to a herbalist's daughter to keep him quietly out of politics. Nobody expected his son to be born with a full root. Chancellor Thorne's spies found out before my first birthday. He didn't wait to see what kind of man I'd grow into. He decided I was a threat the moment the physicians confirmed it, and he spent 17 years making sure everyone at court agreed with him. The rooting rite, the ritual that cut my power away, wasn't punishment. It was insurance. A tradition older than the empire itself, used exactly 3 times in recorded history on root bearers too dangerous or too inconvenient to simply execute. I was the 4th. Chancellor Eunuch Thorne presided over it personally. His son Cassian stood in the front row and laughed. His daughter Selka wasn't there. I remember that detail mattering to me even then, though I couldn't have told you why. None of them expected me to come back. Root bearers who avoid the rite entirely don't have it much easier. The Empire runs sweeps through the border villages every few years. Imperial inspectors testing children for traces of power, dragging away anyone who lights up their instruments. Some get recruited, most get relocated, which is the Empire's polite word for disappeared. Growing up in Ashvale, my new family's tiny border village, I heard those sweep stories the way other kids heard ghost stories. Something that happened to someone else, somewhere else, until it didn't. I turned 6 the year the inspectors first came through our village. I hid in the root cellar for 2 straight days, terrified an instrument would somehow sense what I was carrying. It didn't. Whatever regrew inside me apparently didn't register the same way it used to, and I had no idea if that was luck or something worse. That was the day I decided waiting around to find out wasn't good enough anymore. I found Yeva the summer I turned 7, half by accident and half because the whole village whispered that the old woman living past the tree line used to be a battlefield healer before she got too old to keep up with the wars. She caught me trying to teach myself breathing forms out of a book I'd stolen from the traveling merchant's cart. Forms I half remembered from a life I wasn't supposed to remember at all. "Where did a blacksmith's boy learn imperial breathing forms?" she asked. Not really a question. I lied. She didn't buy it for a second. Yeva had spent 30 years around root bearers before she retired to Ashvale to disappear. She knew what she was looking at within one afternoon of watching me try to force energy through channels that had never once been trained. She also knew exactly what would happen to me if the wrong person found out first. "Whatever you are," she said, "you are not ready, and you will get yourself killed being this careless." I told her I already knew what it felt like to die. She went very quiet after that. From that day on, she trained me. Not out of kindness, she'd insist, but because a wild root left untrained is a disaster waiting to happen, and she didn't feel like cleaning up the mess. I didn't argue. I needed her too much to care why she was helping. The training was brutal in a way nothing in my old life had prepared me for, mostly because in my old life, nobody had bothered training me at all. Every morning before the forge opened, I ran the breathing forms until my hands shook. Every evening after chores, Yeva ran me through control drills designed to keep my power contained instead of leaking out and lighting up every imperial sensor within 5 miles. "A full root untrained is a bonfire in a hay barn," she told me once. "You don't get to be strong until you stop being dangerous to yourself first." 2 years in, I could hold a stable channel for almost a full minute without it slipping. 4 years in, I could throw a controlled burst without shattering the practice dummy into splinters, most of the time. 6 years in, Yeva stopped correcting my forms and started correcting my instincts instead, which she said was the harder problem to fix. I was 14 the first time I asked her exactly how strong I could get. She looked at me for a long moment before she answered. "Strong enough that the people who hunt root bearers for a living would call what's inside you a myth. Strong enough that if you're ever careless again, they won't just cut you this time." I already knew what this time meant. I didn't need her to finish that sentence. The first time anyone outside Yeva saw what I could actually do, I was 15, and it wasn't on purpose. A ridgeback wolf pack came down from the eastern peaks that autumn. 3 of them, starving and bold enough to hit the village at dusk instead of waiting for full dark. I was hauling water when I heard the screaming. A ridgeback had a boy pinned against the well wall, my neighbor's youngest, 6 years old, too terrified to even run. I didn't think. I didn't calculate control percentages or channel ratios or any of the careful math Yeva had spent 8 years drilling into me. I just moved, and the root moved with me, faster and rawer than anything I'd ever let out on purpose. The ridgeback died before it finished its second lunge. So did the second one, when it came at me instead of the boy. The third one ran, and I let it. The whole thing took maybe 4 seconds. It felt like it lasted an hour. By the time the village elders arrived with torches and hunting spears, I was standing over 2 dead wolves with scorch marks radiating out from my hands in a pattern no blacksmith's son should ever have been able to produce, and half of Ashvale was staring at me like they'd never seen me before. They hadn't. Not really. "He saved my boy," the boy's mother kept saying, over and over, half sobbing, half something closer to fear. Yeva got to me before anyone could ask the wrong question out loud. She told the elders it was an old trick her late husband taught her, something she'd passed on for emergencies, nothing worth reporting to the capital. Most of them believed her, most of them wanted to believe her, because the alternative meant admitting a root-bearer had been living quietly in their village for years, and reporting that came with its own dangers for everyone who'd known and said nothing. Not everyone let it go, though. Old Farmer Delic cornered Yeva outside the chapel 2 days later, arguing loud enough that half the square heard it, saying a village with a hidden root-bearer was a village one bad rumor away from an imperial cleansing squad. He wasn't wrong to be scared. He was just scared of the wrong person. Yeva talked him down. I'm still not entirely sure what she said to him, only that Delic avoided my eyes for the next 2 years and never brought it up again. The kids in the village split into 2 camps after that. Half of them started following me around like I was some kind of local hero, which was almost worse than the fear. The other half crossed the street when they saw me coming, whispering the word nobody in Ashvale wanted to say out loud in front of an inspector. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a lot of things that year that turned out to be lies. That wasn't a trick, Yeva told me that night, her voice low and furious in a way I'd never heard from her before. That was a full root discharge with 0 containment, and you're lucky it only cost you exhaustion instead of a burned-out channel, or worse. There was a kid, Yeva. What was I supposed to do? Calculate first? You were supposed to have enough control that you didn't need to choose between the two. She was right, and we both knew it. From that night on, our training doubled. Twice the drills, half the sleep. She stopped treating me like a student with time to spare and started treating me like someone on a countdown, because that's exactly what I'd just become. Word travels slow in a border village, but it travels. Within a season, rumors of the blacksmith's boy who killed 2 Ridgebacks barehanded had drifted to 3 neighboring villages, exaggerated a little more with every telling. I didn't know it yet, but one of those versions of the story eventually reached an imperial way station, filed under exactly the kind of minor regional oddity that got flagged for the next scheduled inspection sweep. The one that came a year early. The one with Instructor Kessler's new instruments. I didn't put the pieces together until much later. By then, it was already too late to take any of it back. 6 months after the Ridgeback attack, a different story reached Ashvale. One I still think about more than almost anything else from those years. A boy from a village 2 days south, 13 years old, got flagged during a routine inspection sweep. Not a false reading. A real one, minor, barely a flicker of dormant potential, nothing close to what I was carrying. They took him anyway. His family petitioned for his return for months, sending letters to every official who might listen. Yeva heard the full story from a traveling healer who'd treated the boy's mother for the grief that never really went away. There was no execution, no dramatic rooting rite, nothing the Empire could be publicly blamed for. Just a boy who went to a specialized academy and was never heard from again, and a family left with nothing but silence and a folder of unanswered letters. That's what happens to the small ones, Yeva told me, quieter than I'd ever heard her. The ones with barely a spark. Imagine what they'd do with someone like you, if they ever confirmed it instead of just suspecting it. I already knew what they'd do with someone like me. I'd lived through it once. My parents never knew the specifics. I made sure of that, even as watching me disappear into the hills with Yeva for hours at a time, on top of a full day at the forge, started raising its own quiet questions around our dinner table. You're not just learning herbcraft from that old woman, my father said once. Not really a question either, setting down his tools and studying me with the particular kind of tired patience only a blacksmith raising a strange, secretive son could manage. I told him it was easier if he didn't ask. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded and never brought it up again, though I caught him watching the road out of Ashvale more carefully after that, the way a man watches for a storm he can feel coming but can't yet see. My mother handled it differently. She started leaving extra bread wrapped in cloth by the door on the mornings I left before dawn for training, never saying a word about it, never asking where I really went. I understood, eventually, that this was its own kind of conversation, one neither of us knew how to have any other way. I loved them for not asking. I hated, sometimes, how much that silence cost all three of us. That story about the boy from the south changed something in how I trained after that. It stopped feeling like preparation for some distant, hypothetical danger, and started feeling like the only thing standing between me and becoming another unanswered letter in some other family's drawer. Yeva introduced a new discipline into my training not long after, something she called anchor breathing, a technique meant to suppress a root reading down past even a baseline false negative, useful for exactly the kind of close, prolonged contact with imperial officials I hadn't needed yet, but eventually would. It came with a cost. Holding an anchor breath suppression for more than a few minutes left me drained for hours afterward, sometimes sick enough that I couldn't stand without support. Yeva made sure I understood that cost thoroughly before she'd let me rely on it for anything real. "This isn't a trick you use casually," she said. "This is a trick you use when the alternative is worse than collapsing afterward. Understand the difference before you ever need to." I practiced it until I could hold it for 11 minutes without passing out. I hoped, quietly, that I'd never actually need to find out what happened at minute 12. I used it for the first time for real less than a year later, standing in the village square while Instructor Kessler's crystal rod hovered over my chest. The real trouble started when I was 16, the year the Empire's sweep teams changed their methods. New inspectors, new instruments. Instruments sensitive enough, apparently, to catch what the old ones missed. I found out the hard way, standing in the village square with half of Ashvale, watching an Imperial officer named Instructor Bram Kessler walk down the line of children with a pulsing crystal rod, checking each one like cattle at auction. Kessler wasn't cruel. That almost made it worse. He was efficient, polite, and utterly unbothered by the fact that relocated children never rode home. He got to me. The rod in his hand flickered. Not much. Just enough. Just a stutter of light that made his eyes narrow and his hand pause half a second too long over my chest. My heart dropped straight through the floor. "Interesting," Kessler said, quiet enough that only I could hear it. "Hold still." I didn't hold still. I panicked. And panic is exactly the wrong instinct for someone trying to keep a root contained, and for one horrible second I felt the channels inside me start to slip. Yeva's voice was in my head before I even decided to move. "Breathe, contain, don't feed it." I clamped down so hard my vision blurred, forced the leak shut through sheer stubborn will, and by the time Kessler blinked again, the rod had gone dark. "False reading," he muttered, moving to the next child. "These instruments have been unreliable all season." I didn't breathe again until he was 3 houses down the row. That night, Yeva didn't scold me. She looked scared, which was worse. "They're recalibrating their instruments across the whole border region," she said. "Ashvale won't be safe for you much longer. Not with a reading like that on record, even a false one. They'll come back to check. So what do I do?" She was quiet for a long time before she answered. "You stop hiding in a village that can't protect you, and you go somewhere they'd never think to look for a root bearer running loose. Somewhere with walls, records, and enough noble sons around that one more talented commoner in the conscription lottery won't raise a single eyebrow." I already knew what she meant before she said it. Koreth Academy. The Empire's military academy. The exact kind of place Chancellor Thorne's family had spent generations feeding their golden children into. The last place in the world I should have wanted to walk into on purpose. It was also the only place close enough to Thorne's world that I might finally get answers about who gave the order to poison my tea 4 months after they cut me open, and far enough from Ashvale that if I burned it down chasing those answers, nobody I loved would burn with it. "When's the conscription lottery?" I asked. 2 months, Yeva said. "And Riven, if you're doing this to find whoever poisoned you, that boy died 17 years ago. Let him stay dead. Go for a future, not a grave." I told her I would. I was already lying to both of us. The conscription lottery wasn't really a lottery. Everyone in Ashvale knew that. Nobles bought their sons' guaranteed placement, and commoners fought over the handful of open slots left, usually 2 or 3 per year out of hundreds of applicants. I trained for 2 months straight, hiding every scrap of real ability from the village trial officials, showing just enough raw talent to earn a slot without earning a second glance from anyone with a crystal rod. It worked. Barely. I left Ashvale with a travel pack, a borrowed sword, and Yeva's last piece of advice ringing in my ears. Control first, ambition second, and never let them see the full picture until you're ready for what happens next. The 3-day road to Korath cut through the Bramwood Pass, a stretch of forest notorious for bandits preying on lone travelers and merchant caravans too small to afford guards. I wasn't worried about bandits. I should have been worried about the kind of bandits who specialized in something else entirely. They hit our travel group on the second night, 6 of them, and within the first minute I realized they weren't robbing anyone. They moved straight past the merchant's strongbox and went for the travelers instead, checking wrists, checking necks, looking for something specific. Root hunters, the caravan guard hissed, drawing his blade. Poachers. They sell root bearers to black market brokers in the capital, alive if they can manage it. My stomach dropped. If even one of them carried a sensing instrument like Kessler's, 3 years of careful control meant nothing the second they got close enough to scan me. I stayed in the shadows at the back of the group, letting the guards handle the fight, keeping my channel as flat and dead as I could force it. It almost worked. Almost. One of the poachers grabbed a merchant's daughter no older than 12, dragging her toward the tree line while she screamed, and every careful instinct Yeva had drilled into me went straight out the window the second I heard that sound. I didn't use the root, not directly. I used a fallen branch, ordinary steel-tipped and heavy, and put every bit of my regular strength behind it instead, dropping the poacher before he made it 10 more steps. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the technique Yeva spent a decade teaching me. But it worked, and more importantly, it didn't light up anything a sensing rod could detect. I found out later, from the caravan guard, that the poacher I'd knocked out had a cracked sensing rod in his coat. The housing shattered when he hit the ground. Whatever reading it caught in that last second before it broke never made it to anyone who could use it. That was luck. I was starting to realize how much of my life so far had depended on luck, and how quickly that kind of luck ran out for people like me. The other poachers scattered once their leader went down, more interested in staying alive than finishing whatever job they'd been sent to do. The caravan guard clapped me on the shoulder afterward, calling me the bravest fool he'd ever traveled with. The merchant's daughter's mother cried and tried to press half her coin purse into my hands, which I refused. I didn't feel brave. I felt like I'd just gotten a preview of exactly how careful I was going to have to be for the rest of my life, because the Empire wasn't the only thing hunting people like me anymore. There was an entire market for it now, and I hadn't even reached the academy yet. Before we parted ways at the academy gates, the guard, a grizzled ex-soldier named Ordo, pulled me aside. Whoever those poachers were working for, he said, they weren't freelancing. Poacher crews like that report to buyers with real coin, and real coin in this business usually traces back to somebody with a noble seal protecting them from ever getting caught. Watch yourself in there, kid. Titles don't always mean safe. I didn't think much of it at the time. I filed it away as one more warning in a life that had started collecting them faster than I could keep track. I should have listened closer. Ordo's warning turned out to matter more than either of us understood standing at those gates, though it would be a long time before I found out exactly how much. Korath Academy sat carved into a mountainside 3 days from the capital, all black stone towers and imperial banners, built to remind every student inside it exactly whose empire they were training to serve. I hated it on sight. It still felt like walking home, in the worst possible way. The entrance trials ran for a week. Physical assessments, basic channel tests, sparring brackets meant to sort 300 hopefuls into the 60 who'd actually get a place. I kept my channel output low enough to pass without triggering anything, which put me solidly in the middle of the pack. Forgettable. Exactly what I wanted. Then they called the sparring bracket, and I heard a name that stopped my whole body cold. Cassian Thorne. He walked out from the noble applicant's tent like he already owned the mountain the academy sat on, 17 years old, golden-haired, smiling the exact same smile he'd worn while flicking wine in my face a lifetime ago. He didn't recognize me. Of course he didn't. The boy he remembered was dead, cut open in a courtyard he probably didn't think about twice a year. I recognized him instantly. Every single detail. The way he tilted his chin up before he spoke, like he was already bored of whoever he was talking to. He had no idea who he was standing 3 names away from, and something ugly and satisfied uncoiled in my chest for the first time in this entire second life. Cassian's bracket wasn't mine. Not that day. I watched him demolish his first opponent in 11 seconds, showing off a root talent that was genuinely strong. Thorn blood ran deep, I'd give him that, and I watched the crowd of nobles cheer like they were watching a prized hound perform tricks. My own bracket came an hour later. My opponent was a merchant's son named Devrin. Decent footwork, mediocre control, exactly the kind of match I could win without revealing anything real. I won in under a minute, clean and forgettable, just talented enough, nothing more. I told myself that was the plan working. Then, walking off the sparring floor, I passed close enough to Cassian's group to hear him laugh and say something about commoners playing soldier, and every year of Yeva's careful control training nearly came undone in a single heartbeat. Nearly. I kept walking. I kept my face blank. And I promised myself, quietly, that whatever bracket eventually put us in the same ring for real, I would not hold back a second time. The Academy's channel assessments used something far more advanced than Kessler's handheld rod, a full sensing chamber built into the mountain itself, designed to measure exact root output down to the smallest fraction. I'd spent 3 years dreading this exact moment. Yeva had prepared me for it as best she could from a distance, sending instructions through a merchant contact about how the chambers worked and how to fake a flat baseline reading without triggering the machine's anomaly detection. In theory, it was possible. In practice, walking into that chamber alone, I had never actually tested it under real conditions. The instructor running my assessment was a sharp-eyed woman named Instructor Vashti, who had a reputation among the applicants for catching more fakers and cheats than anyone else on staff. She studied the readout for a long moment after my test finished, long enough that my pulse spiked hard enough I was half convinced the machine could detect that too. "Flat baseline," she finally said. "Unremarkable. Next." I didn't breathe out until I was 3 hallways away. That same week, I met the one cadet at Korath who never once treated me like I was invisible. A wiry border region recruit named Petra Kolm, sharp-tongued and openly unimpressed by half the noble applicants swaggering around the yard. "You're hiding something," she told me flatly, on our second conversation, watching me deliberately lose a footwork drill I could have won easily. "Everyone's hiding something here." "Sure, but most people are hiding that they're weak. You're hiding that you're not." I didn't confirm or deny it. She didn't push, which told me more about her than a direct answer would have. 3 days later, a notice went up across every dormitory board, an imperial directive tightening route registration requirements academy-wide, citing recent irregular activity in the border provinces as justification. I read it twice, feeling my stomach twist. Border provinces could have meant 100 different villages. It could also have meant exactly one wolf attack that had traveled further than anyone intended. Petra caught me staring at the notice a beat too long. "You look like that notice is about you specifically," she said. "Everyone looks guilty reading a registration notice." "Not like that, they don't." I laughed it off. She let it go, but I noticed, from that day forward, she started positioning herself near me during drills in a way that looked casual and definitely wasn't the kind of careful attention that meant she'd decided, without saying so, that whatever I was hiding was worth watching over instead of reporting. I didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. With Petra, I eventually learned, it was usually both at once. I made it into Korath Academy's incoming class. 60 new cadets, houses assigned by rank, dormitories built into the mountain's lower halls where commoners and minor nobles mixed just enough to remind everyone the Empire claimed to reward talent over blood. I kept my head down for 3 weeks. Then a name got assigned to oversee my house's discipline reports, and every plan I'd built fell apart at once. Selka Thorn. I hadn't expected to see her at all, let alone standing in my dormitory hallway with a ledger under one arm, reading off room assignments in a voice that didn't match her brother's arrogance at all. Flat, careful, watching everyone a half-second longer than necessary. She read my name off the list, Riven Ashcroft. Her eyes flicked up, held on my face, and something in her expression snagged. It wasn't recognition, not exactly, more like a splinter she couldn't quite place. I told myself it was nothing. I was wrong. 2 nights later, I found a folded note under my dormitory door. No signature, just a question, written in careful handwriting. "Did you know a prince named Edrin Sol died the same year you were born?" My whole body went cold reading it. Nobody in this life knew that name. I had never once said it out loud since I woke up in a stranger's blanket 17 years ago. I burned the note that night and told myself I was being paranoid. Selka Thorne couldn't possibly know anything real. She was a child when it happened. That, it turned out, was exactly the problem. She'd been a child who never stopped asking why her family kept a locked case file about a purge nobody would explain to her. Cassian Thorne, it turned out, held grudges the way other people held breath, without even seeming to notice he was doing it. About a week after the note appeared under my door, during a joint squad exercise meant to test coordination between houses, Cassian's group and mine got paired for a live drill in the lower training caverns, mock combat scored by instructors watching from an observation ledge above. I should have seen it coming. He'd spent weeks watching me climb the rankings faster than a border commoner had any business climbing them, and men like Cassian don't handle being outpaced well. Halfway through the exercise, he accidentally redirected a live training charge straight at me instead of the practice dummy, hard enough to seriously injure anyone without proper control. I deflected it, barely, and without using anything that would show up as more than baseline reflexes on the observation instruments, but I deflected it clean, and the charge slammed into the cavern wall instead, cracking stone that was rated to survive far worse. The instructors up on the ledge went very quiet. "Equipment malfunction," Cassian said instantly, smooth as anything, already spinning the story before anyone could ask him directly. The charge redirector must have misfired. Nobody believed him. Nobody could prove otherwise either, not with the observation logs showing exactly what he wanted them to show, a story his father's name made very easy to make disappear. I could have called it out. I could have pushed harder, forced an investigation, made noise. I didn't. Making noise was the last thing I needed with an untested channel reading and a stack of secrets I couldn't afford anyone digging into. So I let it go, publicly, and filed it away privately, in the same growing list as everything else Cassian Thorne would eventually answer for. He must have read my silence as fear, because 2 days later he tried again, this time cornering me alone in an empty corridor with 2 of his friends flanking him. "You deflected that charge clean," he said, no pretense left in his voice. "Nobody deflects a live charge that clean, without training most commoners never get." "Who are you really? Someone who's about to walk away," I said, "unless you want to explain to your father exactly why you tried to seriously injure a classmate during a scored exercise." It wasn't a threat with much weight behind it yet. It didn't need to be. Cassian's whole worldview ran on the assumption that his father's name made him untouchable, and the one thing that worldview couldn't survive was uncertainty about whether that protection actually extended to attacking people quietly, off the record, where his father might not approve of the risk. He let me pass. He didn't stop watching me after that, though, and I didn't stop watching him either. 2 very different people, both convinced the other one was hiding something dangerous. For once, we were both right. Selka heard about the equipment malfunction within a day, the way she seemed to hear about everything that happened inside those mountain halls. She didn't confront me about it. She just started showing up in places our paths didn't usually cross, watching a half-second longer than casual interest required, exactly the way she had the very first day she read my name off a dormitory list. I ran into her directly a few days later, in the Academy's East Library, though "ran into" was generous phrasing for something that felt far too deliberate to be coincidence. She was seated at a table stacked with old medical scrolls, the kind of dense imperial archive material most cadets avoided on principle, and she didn't look up when I approached, which told me she'd already noticed me coming from across the room. "Regenerative medicine," she said, tapping the scroll in front of her without preamble. "Fascinating field. Mostly theoretical. Most physicians agree the body can't regrow certain things once removed, no matter how strong the underlying root. Sounds like a dead field then. Mostly. There's a handful of recorded exceptions. All of them centuries old, all of them heavily disputed, and all of them involving root bearers strong enough that court physicians at the time genuinely couldn't explain what they were looking at." I kept my expression carefully blank, the same flat calm Yeva had spent a decade teaching me to hold under pressure. "Interesting research topic for a disciplinary officer. I have interesting hobbies." She finally looked up at me, and there was nothing accusing in her expression, just a kind of tired, careful curiosity that felt more dangerous than open hostility would have. "My father used to talk about a case like that, years ago, before I was old enough to really understand what he meant. A root bearer who shouldn't have been able to do what he apparently did. Court gossip, there's a lot of it in a place like this." "There is," she agreed. Most of it isn't true. I used to believe all of it wasn't true, actually, right up until about 3 weeks ago. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. The silence felt like standing at the edge of something neither of us was ready to step off yet. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally, quieter now. "Not as a disciplinary officer, just as myself." "You can ask. If someone did what my father's old case file describes, if they really came back from something that should have been permanent, do you think they'd want revenge? Or do you think they'd just want to be left alone to live a life nobody ruined for them a second time?" It wasn't a question about theory anymore, and we both knew it. I thought about Yeva telling me to let a dead prince stay dead. I thought about Cassian's smile in the ceremony courtyard 17 years ago, and his father's voice telling a terrified boy he should say thank you. "I think," I said carefully, "it depends entirely on whether the people responsible ever showed a single sign of regretting it." Something in her face shifted, small but real. "My father doesn't talk about regret. He talks about necessity. There's a difference, and I don't think he's ever once noticed it." She didn't push further after that. She gathered her scrolls, told me the library closed in an hour like she hadn't just handed me the most dangerous conversation of my second life, wrapped in careful hypotheticals, and left without looking back. I sat there for a long time after she'd gone, turning her question over in my head. I still didn't fully trust her. I was no longer entirely sure I could afford not to. I didn't have long to sit with it either. 4 days after that library conversation, worse news reached me from Ashvale. A courier found me during morning drills, out of breath, carrying a message that made my stomach drop before I even opened it. Imperial inspectors had swept back through the border villages early, months ahead of schedule, using the new instruments Chancellor had tested on me the year before. Ashvale included. Yeva was gone. Not dead, the courier said, though nobody seemed entirely sure. Taken for questioning after inspectors found unregistered training equipment in her cottage. Equipment built for a root bearer nobody in the village was supposed to have. I stood there in the training yard with the message shaking in my hand, and for one dangerous second, every ounce of control Yeva had spent 10 years drilling into me nearly burned away in pure, blinding rage. That should have been the end of my careful plan. It wasn't. It was the moment I stopped having one. If the Empire had Yeva, it was only a matter of time before questioning turned into torture, and torture turned into a name. My name. Whatever careful cover I'd built at Korath had an expiration date now, and I had no idea how close it already was. I had 2 choices. Keep hiding and hope Yeva held out long enough for me to find another way, or force my hand early, get strong enough fast enough to actually threaten the people holding her, and accept that the whole Empire might learn what I really was in the process. I thought about Yeva telling me to let that dead prince stay dead. I thought about Cassian Thorne calling commoners playing soldier. I thought about the folded note under my door, and Selka Thorne's eyes catching on my face a half-second too long. Then I went and requested an early placement in the Academy's next open trial, the Ascension Duels, the one event held publicly in front of the entire noble court, including, every single year, Chancellor Eunuch Thorne himself. If I couldn't hide anymore, I decided, I would at least choose exactly when and where the truth came out. The Ascension Duels ran 3 weeks later, held in Korath's grand arena, carved straight into the mountain, banners of every noble house hanging from the stone galleries above a packed crowd of court officials, instructors, and family members who'd traveled in just to watch their children perform. Chancellor Eunuch Thorne sat in the judge's box, exactly where I knew he'd be, close enough that I could see his face without straining. He hadn't aged the way I remembered, or maybe I just hadn't looked at him properly in 17 years, not since the moment right before the blade came down. I drew Cassian Thorne in the final bracket. Of course I did. The tournament officials paired top performers against each other for the final round, and I'd spent 3 weeks not holding back in every qualifying match, climbing the rankings hard enough that even Cassian's smug crowd of admirers had started watching me with something closer to suspicion than dismissal. "The nobody from the border," Cassian said when they called our names, loud enough for the whole arena to hear. I was wondering when someone would finally give me a real opponent. I didn't answer him. I'd promised myself I wouldn't hold back this time, and words felt like wasted breath compared to what I actually planned to do. The bell rang. Cassian moved first, fast, a root-fueled strike that would have ended most cadets' matches in one blow. I let it get close enough to feel the heat off it. Then I moved. 10 years of Yeva's control drills came out all at once. Not the wild, leaking power that had nearly given me away in front of Kessler's crystal rod, but something channeled, precise, and utterly unlike anything the crowd had ever seen from a supposedly unranked bloodline. Cassian's strike missed by an inch. Mine didn't. I heard the crowd go silent before I even registered I'd won. Cassian was on the ground, his own weapon knocked clean out of his hands, staring up at me with an expression that had never once, in either of my lives, been aimed at me before. Fear. For one suspended second, nobody in the arena moved, not the instructors, not the noble families in the galleries, not even Cassian, still flat on his back staring up at me like the ground itself had betrayed him. Then the noise came all at once, a wave of stunned murmurs rolling up through the stone galleries. Hundreds of voices trying to make sense of what they'd just watched a border commoner do to a Thorn heir in under 30 seconds. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at the judges' box because the only reaction in that entire arena that actually mattered to me was the one I still hadn't gotten yet. "That's impossible," someone in the gallery said. "That technique, that's a bloodline root form. Nobody's used that publicly in 17 years. I looked straight up at the judges' box while I said my next words, loud enough to carry. "Then I suppose you should ask the Chancellor why he thought it was gone." The arena went dead quiet. Chancellor Yorick Thorn stood up slowly, his face doing something I'd spent 17 years imagining and never actually expected to see in real life. Genuine, uncontrolled shock, cracking straight through decades of practiced court composure. He knew that form. He'd watched a physician train it out of a terrified 12-year-old prince as leverage, years before he'd ever ordered it cut away entirely. There was exactly one bloodline in the Empire that used it, and he'd spent 17 years absolutely certain that bloodline ended in his own courtyard. "Who taught you that technique?" he said, and his voice, for the first time I could remember, wasn't steady. I looked him dead in the eye across the length of the arena. "You did," I said. "You just didn't realize you were teaching the same student twice." Guards moved before Yorick even gave the order, closing in around the arena floor with weapons half drawn, and for one heartbeat I thought I'd miscalculated everything, that I'd just handed myself back to the same man who'd already killed me once. Then the Academy's headmaster stood, sharp and furious, and reminded the entire noble gallery in a voice that echoed off the mountain stone that the Ascension duels fell under Academy jurisdiction, not the Chancellor's private authority, and that no student, regardless of bloodline questions, would be seized off a sanctioned dueling floor without formal charges. Yorick sat back down, slowly. His eyes never left my face. Around the gallery, I caught fragments of conversation breaking out among the watching nobles, sharp and urgent, the kind of political calculation that moved fast, in a court built on alliances and leverage. A Thorn heir humiliated publicly by an unranked commoner was one kind of scandal. A Thorn heir humiliated by someone wielding a bloodline technique the Chancellor himself was supposed to have erased 17 years ago was an entirely different, far more dangerous kind of scandal, and every noble family with a grudge against House Thorn understood exactly which one they'd just witnessed. I didn't need to understand court politics well enough to read every implication in that noise. I only needed to understand one thing. Whatever protection Yorick Thorn still had left in this court, I'd just spent a significant piece of it in under 30 seconds, and men like him did not forgive people who cost them that kind of currency quietly. I'd won the duel. I'd won my place at the top of the incoming class, guaranteed advancement, and exactly the kind of attention I'd spent 10 years hiding from. I'd also just told the one man responsible for cutting me open and poisoning my tea that I remembered every single detail of both. Cassian found me before I even made it back to the dormitory halls, shoving past 2 other cadets to plant himself directly in my path, his earlier composure completely gone. "What did you mean? Teaching the same student twice?" he demanded. "That form? My father trained someone else in that form? Who? Ask him? I'm asking you." "Then you already know I'm not going to answer." He grabbed my arm, hard enough that a week earlier I might have worried about the noise it would make if I pulled free too fast. I didn't worry about it anymore. I peeled his hand off without effort, calm in a way that clearly unsettled him more than if I'd shouted. "You should be more afraid of me than you are," he said, low, trying to recover some footing. "I already know exactly how afraid of your family I should be," I said. I did that math a long time ago. You're not the part of it that scares me. He didn't have a response for that. For the first time since I'd met him in either life, Cassian Thorne looked less like a golden heir and more like a boy who just realized the ground under him wasn't as solid as he'd been told. He left without another word. I let him. I made it 2 more corridors before a second problem found me, this one quieter and far more dangerous. A man in plain robes fell into step beside me near the dormitory stairwell. No house colors, no rank insignia, the kind of deliberate anonymity that only came from people who worked directly for someone who preferred not to be traced. "The Chancellor would like a private conversation," he said. "Tonight. Nothing formal. No guards, no charges. And just a conversation." Every instinct Yeva had ever drilled into me screamed that walking into a private, unwitnessed room with Yorick Thorne, hours after publicly accusing him in front of the entire court, was exactly the kind of mistake that got root-bearers quietly relocated. "Tell the Chancellor I'm flattered," I said. "I'll consider it once he sends the request through the headmaster, in writing, with witnesses present." The man's expression didn't change. That wasn't really a request. Then he can explain to the entire noble gallery why a student who just won the Ascension duels went missing on the same night, in a jurisdiction he already publicly lost control of once today. I kept walking. He didn't follow, though I felt eyes on my back the entire way to my dormitory door, and I didn't fully believe I was safe until the door was locked behind me. I stood there for a long moment with my back against the door, heart still hammering harder than it had during the entire duel. Winning in the arena had been the easy part, it turned out. Surviving the hours immediately afterward was going to be the real test, and I had a feeling that test wasn't close to finished for the night. That's when I found the second note under my door. No lock could keep Selka Thorne's people out of anywhere in this academy, apparently, and I was starting to understand exactly how deep her father's paranoia had trained her to dig. This note wasn't a question. I pulled the old case file after the duel. There's a detail in Edrin Sol's execution report that never made sense to my father's investigators. I think I finally understand why. Meet me at the East Archive Tower at midnight. Come alone, or don't come at all, but if you don't, I go straight to my father with what I know. I sat there holding that note for a long time, thinking about Yeva somewhere in an imperial holding cell because of what I was, thinking about Yorick's face going pale in the judge's box, thinking about a dead prince's name written in a stranger's handwriting. I had exactly 1 hour to decide whether Selka Thorne was the first real ally I'd found in either of my lives, or the trap that finally finished what her father started 17 years ago. At midnight, I climbed the East Archive Tower stairs anyway. She was waiting at the top with a lantern in one hand and an old, sealed file in the other, and the first thing she said to me wasn't a threat. It was my old name. "Hello, Edrin. If you want to see what's in that file, smash the like button. Let's get this to 700 likes, and Chapter 2 is coming fast."